Hello, and welcome to this Heroes of Black Reach tutorial about Zone of Control. Zone of Control is an important concept to understand when playing Heroes of Black Reach, and this tutorial will explain what it is and how it's used in the game. Okay, so let's dive straight in. What is Zone of Control? Each unit in the game exerts control over the squares that surround it. So in this picture, the Sluggers unit surrounded by 8 squares marked in green, and it exerts a zone of control to those squares. Vehicles and infantry both have a zone of control, but really only the zone of control for infantry is used in the game, so I'm only really going to consider that in this tutorial. If a unit has terrain elements within its zone of control, then provided it has line of sight into those elements, either clear or obscured, then they're still part of its zone of control. However, if one of the squares in their zone of control contains impassable terrain, then that is not considered part of their zone of control. So in this picture, the Sluggers unit zone of control does not extend into the square in the top right. Let's have a look now at how zone of control affects movement. Here we have a Sluggers unit with its zone of control marked in green. If we add a tactical unit, we can look at how the tactical unit will interact with the Sluggers zone of control. First of all, the tactical unit is allowed to move into the zone of control of an enemy unit. The tactical unit can then move out of the zone of control of the Sluggers. Likewise, he can also move into the zone of control of the Sluggers again. So movement into and out of the zone of control of an enemy unit is legal. However, he cannot move within the zone of control of the Sluggers. So the 2 squares that have been marked with X's are not legal moves for the tactical unit. So the key thing to remember here is that a unit can move into or out of another unit's zone of control, but it cannot move within. Let's now look at how zone of control affects assault. Here we have a situation where the Sluggers unit is going to be assaulted by the tactical squad. We've marked the zone of control of the Sluggers unit in green. So the tactical unit moves into the zone of control of the Sluggers and then engages that Sluggers unit in close combat. Now, supposing the tactical unit wins that assault, then the Sluggers units will be pushed back, and the Orc player has 3 choices as to where they can place their Sluggers units. The Orc player chooses that location. So that's pretty simple, straightforward assault. Zone of control doesn't really have a huge impact on the direct assault like that. Let's have a look what happens then if we have another unit engaged. So the plasma gun has been added to the top. The plasma gun has this zone of control marked in blue, and we'll see if this has any impact on the Sluggers. So again, the tactical squad assaults the Sluggers unit and wins the assault. We are forced to retreat, and they retreat into the zone of control of the plasma gun. And again, the Orc player can choose which of those 3 locations he wishes to place the Orcs into, and he chooses that location. Okay, let's bring the plasma gun a little bit closer and see how that affects the assault. So this time, the tactical unit is assaulting the Sluggers. Again, wins the assault. But this time, placing those Orc units for their forced move backwards would mean that they would be moving within the zone of control of the plasma gun. This is not allowed. So in this case, not only is the Orc unit damaged, but the Orc unit is actually destroyed and eliminated from the game. Okay, what happens when we add a suppression marker? How do suppression markers affect the zone of control of units? Well, suppression markers remove the zone of control of units. If a unit has a suppression marker, it exerts no zone of control. So in this scenario, we'll repeat the same assault. Tactical unit comes in and assaults the Orcs. The orcs lose the assault, but this time the plasma gun has no zone of control, and so the two squares marked with ticks are perfectly valid locations for the orc player to be forced to move into. So the orc player chooses to move their unit to that location. Let's look again at assault, but a slightly different situation. Let's make it clear that only in the final step can a unit move within an enemy zone of control. So this time we've got Sergeant Voralanus, and he wishes to engage the uppermost Sluggers unit in close combat. He starts off by moving into the zone of control of the nearest Sluggers unit. Now he then cannot move within the zone of control of that Sluggers unit in order to reach the furthest most Sluggers unit. Instead, he would have to move out of the zone of control of the nearest Sluggers unit, then into the zone of control of both of the Sluggers units before he engages that unit in close combat. Next, we'll look at how flying units are affected by zone of control. So here we have a similar situation to the previous example, but this time instead of Sergeant Voralanus, we have an assault unit. Notice that the assault unit has a set of wings surrounding the movement symbol in the bottom left-hand corner. This means that the unit has the ability to fly. So how is a unit that has the ability to fly affected by zone of control? So let's see what happens when the assault unit attacks the furthest most slugger unit. First, it can move into the zone of control of the nearest slugger unit, but because it has the flying symbol, it can ignore the zone of control of any unit. Therefore, it can legally fly within the zone of control of those sluggers units. Then again, it flies within the zone of control before finally assaulting the sluggers unit at the top. Next, we'll look at what happens when you're disembarking vehicles and how zone of control impacts that. So in this setup, we have a rhino and it's surrounded by 3 sluggers units. Inside the rhino, we have Sergeant Voralanus, who has an order token. We have a tactical squad and the plasma gun. So let's mark the zones of control. On the left-hand side, the sluggers unit has that zone of control. On the right-hand side, the sluggers unit has that zone of control. And at the bottom, the sluggers has that zone of control. And you can see how those zones of control are overlapping. So let's imagine that Sergeant Voralanus wishes to disembark the rhino and assault the sluggers unit on the right-hand side. Sergeant Voralanus can disembark any of the squares marked with a tick. This will be considered a move into the zone of control of those orc units. So Sergeant Voralanus disembarks close to the unit on the right-hand side. So Sergeant Voralanus moves within the zone of control for his final step into a close assault with the sluggers unit. He wins that close combat, pushing the sluggers unit back and dragging the zone of control of that unit over to the right. Next, the tactical unit emerges just outside the top end of the rhino and into the zone of control of the sluggers unit on the left-hand side. He cannot make a move to the left because that would be a move within the zone of control of that sluggers unit. So instead, he moves across to the right and then into the zone of control of the sluggers on the right-hand side. Finally, the plasma gun emerges on the left-hand side of the rhino, bottom left, and he cannot then move into any of those squares marked with an X. They will all mean that he moves within the zone of control of those sluggers units. So instead, he chooses to move to that freely occupied square, making a diagonal move, and then chooses to move into the zone of control of the sluggers unit at the bottom. Finally, we'll look at what happens when you disembark destroyed vehicles. In this scenario, we have a rhino and 2 sluggers adjacent to it. And let's assume that a shot comes in and blows up the rhino. At this point, the ultramarine units are forced to disembark the rhino. So these are the squares that the units are allowed to exit. The rule is that you cannot disembark into the zone of control of an enemy unit when you are forced to disembark due to the vehicle being destroyed. So there are only 2 squares where the Ultramarines can deploy to. So the Ultramarine player determines that Sergeant Vorolanus and the plasma gun unit escape the blast, and those units have to have suppression markers added to them. Finally, the tactical unit cannot escape and is destroyed in the explosion. Thank you very much for watching this Heroes of Blackreach tutorial. If you have any feedback, please leave it in the comments below. And if you want to see any more tutorials, then please let me know what you'd find interesting.